when Margot Elgin's assistant spilled her coffee across the cable. Samuel Birch had spent the better part of an hour routing beneath the conference table. Margot did not apologize. She looked down at the man on his knees among the wires and told him, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow, that if he had any real skill he would have finished 3 hours ago and would not still be in her way. Samuel looked up at her from the floor, unhurried, and asked whether she was still planning to be in the Harrington Grand's main ballroom at 9 the following morning. Margot laughed, the short, airless kind of laugh that was less amusement than reminder, and told her assistant to make certain the AV technician was finished and cleared out before any of her people arrived for the evening reception. She walked away in her ivory blazer without looking back. She did not understand yet that Samuel had not actually answered her question. She would not understand why that silence mattered until her general counsel pushed through the ballroom doors. The following night, her face drained of color, and said the 5 words that would end 3 years of Elgin Technologies' most careful planning. Samuel Birch had gotten the call from his daughter that afternoon while unspooling a fiber run on the 3rd floor of the Harrington. Wren Birch was 15 and largely unimpressed by things that were supposed to be impressive, but she had called from the kitchen to say that the wire transfer had cleared and their accountant thought the number on the term sheet was real. Samuel told her to finish her homework before her show, and that real numbers had a way of meaning less than they seemed until someone actually signed something. Wren told him he sounded like a fortune cookie. He told her she sounded like her mother, and they both went quiet for a moment, the way they sometimes did when that comparison surfaced without warning. Margaret Birch had died of a brain aneurysm 6 years earlier, on a Tuesday in November, while Samuel was at a systems security conference in Denver. He had come home to an apartment that was too clean and too quiet, and a daughter who was 9 years old, and asking questions he did not know how to answer. He had left his position as a senior network architect at a defense contractor shortly afterward, not because he had stopped caring about the work, but because the work required travel and travel required someone reliable at home, and he did not trust anyone else to be that person for Wren. The job at the Harrington Grand came through a former colleague. It was honest, physical, predictable in the way grief required things to be predictable. The morning shift ended at 3, which meant he was always there when Wren got off the school bus. Lockbridge had started as something he built because he could not stop building. A behavioral intrusion detection platform designed specifically for the kinds of institutions that could not afford enterprise security but could not afford to be breached either. Hospitals, school districts, small municipal utilities. He had watched too many of those organizations get gutted by ransomware because nobody had ever written a tool that fit their budget and their staffing level at the same time. So he wrote one himself during the hours after Wren went to sleep, at the same desk where he had once done his doctoral coursework. It took 4 years. By the time Elgin Technologies began circling, Lockbridge was already deployed across 19 hospital networks in 7 states, and the term sheet on the table was worth $85 million. Theodore Mack, the attorney who had handled Samuel's incorporation paperwork and stayed on through every subsequent round of negotiation, had sent a message that afternoon confirming that the Elgin board had approved the full amount. Only Samuel's signature remained between Lockbridge and the largest acquisition in Elgin Technologies' 4-year expansion push. Samuel had read the message in the elevator, pocketed his phone, and gone back to the cable run. He had kept his identity separate from the negotiation at his own insistence, preferring to understand what kind of buyer Elgin was before Margot Elgin knew who she was buying from. Margot arrived at the Harrington that evening with the particular energy of someone who had decided in advance that the room did not quite meet her standards. She found fault with the ballroom's lighting before she had fully entered it. She repositioned 3 centerpieces that her own events team had placed. She redirected the caterer's staff in a way that was not so much helpful as demonstrative, establishing early and publicly that her preferences superseded everyone else's judgment. Samuel was still on the floor when she encountered him, organizing the last of the cable management along the baseboard beneath the head table, and she had walked past him twice without acknowledging his presence before the coffee incident introduced them. After her comment about his skill level, Samuel had stood, thanked her assistant for the apology the assistant had offered on Margot's behalf, and gone back to work. For the next hour, he moved through the ballroom with the particular fluency that came from a decade of physical work. Reading the room before it needed to be read, anticipating the next problem before the previous one had finished resolving itself. He had learned this from the Harrington. He had learned it also from the years of raising a daughter alone, which required the same kind of anticipatory intelligence, the same refusal to be surprised by things that could be seen coming from 50 feet away. Lena Strand, the Harrington Grand's general manager and one of the people Samuel trusted most in the world, pulled him aside near the service corridor around 7 to warn him that a young technician named Paolo had made a connection error on the secondary screen feed, and that one of Margot's executives had already flagged it loudly enough for the catering staff to hear. Samuel went to the secondary screen, identified the error without calling attention to Paolo, and corrected it quietly, while telling the young man that the same mistake would take him 30 seconds to catch next time, because now he knew where to look. When Margot's COO, a broad-shouldered man named Preston Dunn, demanded to know who was responsible, Samuel said only that it had been his oversight and that it would not recur. Preston Dunn looked at Samuel the way certain people looked at people they had already categorized, without curiosity, with the mild impatience of someone waiting for a transaction to complete. He made a remark about the Harrington needing to upgrade its technical staff, which drew obligatory laughs from the Elgin associates nearby. Samuel reset the connection and moved to the next task. The moment that changed the evening's temperature came an hour later, when Margot held a wine glass up to the light, found a watermark on the stem, and returned it to the nearest staff member, with a commentary on the Harrington's housekeeping standards that extended, without apparent irony, into a broader observation about the kinds of people who ended up in hospitality careers. The staff member was a young woman named Becca, who had started at the hotel 8 weeks earlier, and whose composure, to her credit, held. Samuel stepped forward and took the glass from Margot's hand before Becca could respond, told Margot he would have it replaced immediately, and walked Becca toward the service station under the pretense of retrieving a clean one. He told Becca to take her break. She looked at him with the expression of someone not yet sure whether she was being protected or managed, and he told her plainly that there was nothing she could have said in that exchange that would have helped her, and that the best response to that kind of behavior was simply to not be present for it. She took her break. When Samuel returned with the replacement glass, Margot did not acknowledge the exchange. She was deep in conversation with Preston about the integration timeline, and Samuel listened without appearing to listen, while he adjusted a microphone stand nearby. What he heard troubled him. Some of the integration assumptions Margot was describing did not align with the terms she had agreed to in writing, and the discrepancy was not small. The evening sharpened around 9 when Margot, in front of the full assembly of executive she had brought from Elgin, made the remark that defined the night. Samuel had offered, gently and accurately, a correction to something Preston Dunn had said about network latency in institutional deployments. A correction that touched directly on the core functionality of the platform Elgin was about to purchase. Margot's expression did not change, but her tone dropped into something colder and flatter. "You set up screens and run cable," she said. "Let the people in the room handle the parts that require actual expertise." Preston laughed. Several associates took their cue from him. Margot held Samuel's gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to make her meaning unmistakable, then turned back to her table. Samuel said, without particular emphasis, that he would keep that in mind, and that he hoped she was still planning to be available at 9 the following morning. Margot told her assistant, without looking at Samuel again, that the AV team should wrap their equipment by midnight and ensure no staff members were lingering in the ballroom when the formal event wound down. For the next 40 minutes, she treated Samuel as furniture, present, functional, beneath consideration. She changed the room's audio balance 3 times through her assistant rather than speaking to him directly. She told a story, at sufficient volume for nearby tables to overhear, about a technology conference she had attended the previous year, at which the AV setup had been so incompetent that she had personally rewired the presentation screen herself. Demonstrating, she said, that these things were not actually difficult if a person had the right kind of mind for them. The implication being that people who did this work for a living were not in possession of that kind of mind. Samuel heard all of it. He continued working. Theodore Mack walked into the Harrington Grand's ballroom at 9:20, slightly ahead of Vivian Tabb, Elgin Technologies' general counsel, both of them arriving from a preliminary review of the final acquisition documents. Theodore spotted Samuel from across the room the way people spotted someone they knew in a crowd, immediately, without searching, and his expression shifted from focused to alarmed within the same half-second. Margot was in the middle of telling Preston that she intended to discuss staffing changes at the Harrington with the hotel's ownership group after the acquisition closed, as a condition of hosting future Elgin events. She did not notice Theodore until he was already at the edge of the table. "Mrs. Elgin," Theodore said. He was careful with his phrasing, the way attorneys were careful when a situation was already difficult, and the next sentence was about to make it considerably more so. "I need to introduce you to someone you've been speaking with this evening." Margot looked from Theodore to Samuel with the flat patience of someone expecting a minor inconvenience. "The gentleman you've been working around tonight is Samuel Birch," Theodore said. "He is the founder and sole owner of Lockbridge Security." The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in layers. First the people closest to Theodore, then the ring beyond them, and then the outer tables, until the ballroom held a particular kind of silence that was less about sound and more about the suspension of ordinary momentum. Margot looked at Samuel. Whatever she was searching for in his face, she did not find it. Vivian Tabb opened the document portfolio she was carrying and compared the profile photograph inside it against the man standing 3 feet away from her. The photograph matched exactly. She closed the portfolio with the deliberate care of someone who needed her hands to do something, while her mind finished processing what her eyes had just confirmed. Margot said the word "setup" before any other word arrived. She said it firmly, the way people said things they were not certain of but needed to sound certain about. Samuel told her he had worked at the Harrington for 11 years and had been on the building's AV team for the last 4 of them, and that nothing about the evening had been arranged in advance to test her or to embarrass her. He said it without anger, because it was simply true. She offered him $15 million above the asking price before the silence had fully reassembled into ordinary air. She proposed renegotiating the terms on the spot. She suggested that the entire evening could be reframed as a misunderstanding born of the Harrington's unclear staff identification protocols. Samuel declined each offer in the order it arrived. When Margot told him, with considerable force, that he would not receive an opportunity like this one again in his career, he turned to Theodore and asked him to send the formal withdrawal notice to Elgin Technologies before the close of business the following morning. The $85 million acquisition dissolved without a single document having been signed. By the following afternoon, Elgin Technologies' communications office had released a statement describing Lockbridge's founder as an individual who had withdrawn from a good faith negotiation in order to extract a higher price. The statement was careful about what it did not say. It made no mention of the Harrington. It made no mention of what had been said in the ballroom. It described Samuel's background in ways that were technically accurate and contextually misleading. An AV technician who had filed some interesting patents. The implication read, rather than a network architect with 20 years of institutional security experience, who had built something that 19 hospital systems trusted with their patient records. Preston Dunn made personal calls to two of Lockbridge's institutional partners over the following week, suggesting that Samuel's decision to walk away from the Elgin deal reflected poor judgment that should concern anyone relying on the platform for critical infrastructure. One of the partner networks requested a call with Samuel directly. He gave it, and the partner renewed their contract that same afternoon. The Harrington was not spared. A coordinated pattern of negative reviews appeared across 3 platforms within 72 hours. 2 corporate accounts that had used the hotel for annual conferences received calls from people connected to Elgin's business network, and both conferences were quietly relocated. Lena Strand did not say anything to Samuel about the financial damage directly, but he saw it in the way she started staying at her desk past closing, and in the careful way she thanked the remaining corporate clients by name when they called to confirm their bookings were unchanged. Samuel sat with that weight the way he sat with most heavy things, steadily, without pretending it was lighter than it was. Ren noticed. She was 15 and observant in the specific way that children who lose a parent young become observant, alert to changes in the emotional temperature of a room before the room announced them. She did not tell her father to give in. She asked him one evening over dinner whether what he was protecting was worth what it was costing the people around him. Samuel did not have an easy answer, and he told her so, which she seemed to find more honest than a simple yes would have been. The real answer came not from resolve alone, but from paperwork. At Vivian Tabb's careful and indirect suggestion, a brief conversation with Theodore that was clearly not what it appeared to be on the surface, Samuel reviewed the full technical implementation plan that Elgin had filed during due diligence. He had been shown a summary during negotiations. He had not been shown the appendix. The appendix described what Elgin actually intended to do with Lockbridge once the acquisition cleared. The platform was to be redeployed as a monitoring tool for Elgin's enterprise clients, specifically, a mechanism for identifying liability exposure within those clients' own network partners. In practice, this meant that whenever Lockbridge flagged unusual activity in a smaller hospital network or a school district system, Elgin's enterprise clients would receive the alert before the affected institution did, giving them the option to restructure contracts and assign liability before the smaller party even knew something had been detected. The institutions Lockbridge had been built to protect would be the last to know when their own systems had been compromised. Samuel's name was to be removed from all Lockbridge documentation within 18 months of the acquisition closing. The intellectual property protections he had specifically negotiated for smaller institutions had been quietly stripped from the version of the contract submitted to Elgin's board. Margot had known about the removal and approved it. He sat with that for a long time. He called Theodore at 11 that night and did not sleep before 2. Elgin then moved to a second strategy. Samuel's engineers discovered, while reviewing a pattern of unusual access requests to Lockbridge's development servers, that a third-party consulting account had extracted early architectural specifications from a protected archive. The consulting account resolved after investigation to a firm with a single active client, a holding company that resolved in turn to Preston Dunn. The extracted documents did not contain finished code, but they contained enough structural detail to allow someone who understood the system to reconstruct its core logic. Elgin announced at a formal press event that it had developed an internal network security platform that made any outside acquisition unnecessary. Margot referred to Samuel at the press conference by name as a technician who had confused a personal project with a serious enterprise product and then made the mistake of believing his leverage was real. Inside Elgin's demonstration code, Samuel's team found a seed string, a specific 40-character identifier Samuel had embedded in an early prototype years before any acquisition discussion had begun. It functioned the way a watermark functioned in a document, invisible in ordinary use, unmistakable under the right kind of examination. Its presence inside Elgin's platform proved without ambiguity that Elgin's new product had been constructed from material taken from Lockbridge's protected development archive. Margot called it a coincidence. Preston said the string had probably entered the codebase through a publicly available API. Neither explanation was consistent with the string's location inside a non-public architectural component that had never been exported from Lockbridge's development environment. Vivian Tabb, speaking to Theodore in a brief and careful conversation, whose record she had clearly decided to preserve on Elgin's own legal servers, confirmed that the decision to proceed with the reconstructed platform had been made with full knowledge of what the source material was, and that the decision had been authorized at the chief executive level. The Elgin board convened an emergency session. Margot walked into that boardroom with the confident bearing of someone who expected to walk out with her position intact. She had spent 3 days preparing a counter-narrative and had not quite allowed herself to believe that a man who ran cable at a hotel could assemble a complete evidentiary record and lay it in front of her own directors. Samuel walked in wearing a jacket he had owned for 8 years. He sat down without speaking first. He waited. Theodore presented the evidence in the order it was most damaging: the appendix and its hidden redistribution mechanism, the architectural documents taken from the protected archive, the seed string and its verified location within Elgin's platform, Vivian Tabb's preserved confirmation, and the records linking the coordinated review campaign against the Harrington to a firm on Elgin's contractor list. Margot interrupted 3 times. Each time the board chair asked her to allow the presentation to conclude. Preston, sensing that his position had become untenable, confirmed in response to a direct question from a board member that each of the decisions he had executed had been made under Margot's explicit authorization. He did not say it out of integrity. He said it because the alternative was to absorb the entire liability himself, and he had already consulted his personal attorney about which outcome his own situation could survive. Several board members suggested, as boards in difficult positions always suggested, that the sensible path was to find a way back to the negotiating table and preserve the competitive advantage that Lockbridge represented. Samuel told them that Lockbridge was no longer available to Elgin Technologies in any form. He had signed an agreement that morning with the Meridian Public Networks Consortium, a cooperative of 41 hospital systems, school districts, and municipal utility networks spanning 12 states. The deal was worth $92 million. Every condition Samuel had originally negotiated was intact. No data sharing with any party not directly protected by the platform, no use of alert data to assign liability before the affected institution was notified, no removal of Samuel's name from the product documentation, equity participation for the engineers who had built Lockbridge through its hardest years, and a standing audit right retained by Lockbridge's team over how the platform's outputs were used. He had not chosen Meridian because the number was slightly higher. He had chosen them because their members were exactly the institutions he had built Lockbridge to defend. And the agreement meant the platform would finally do precisely what it had been designed to do, without being turned sideways in the process. The board voted to terminate Margot Elgin's employment under the for-cause provision of her contract. Preston Dunn was placed on immediate administrative suspension. Vivian Tabb was asked to preserve all materials related to the matter. Margot made no statement before leaving the boardroom. She had spent 11 years building Elgin Technologies into a company whose board would not take a vote like this one lightly, and in the space of 2 weeks she had given them no other option. She returned to the Harrington Grand that evening, where Lena Strand had organized a small dinner to mark the Meridian announcement. The same ballroom, the same tablecloths, and the same low light, and the same audio system that Samuel had tuned to exactly the right level for conversation without amplification. Margot arrived without an invitation, moving through the entrance with the particular energy of someone who had not yet fully processed that her authority was gone. She asked a staff member to have Samuel removed from the private event. Lena Strand crossed the room unhurriedly. She told Margot that Samuel was not available to be removed from anything. He was the guest of honor. His name was on the reservation, and Margot's name had been removed from the hotel's approved guest list at the close of business 3 days earlier, which a brief review of the Harrington's reservation policy would confirm was fully within the hotel's discretion. Margot stood in the entrance of the ballroom for a moment that had no name for what it felt like to be on the other side of an arrangement she had always assumed she would control. Then she left. Samuel watched the door close from across the room, without satisfaction and without particular feeling. What he noticed was that the room had barely paused. The conversations had continued. The servers had continued their rounds. The whole evening had moved forward without her, as evenings did. The Harrington recovered. Samuel used a portion of the Meridian deal to compensate Lena Strand's hotel for the revenue lost during the review campaign, and he established a scholarship fund through the hotel's foundation to help hospitality workers pursue technology certifications, because that border had always seemed to him like one that should not be as difficult to cross as it was. He offered Lena a formal partnership in Lockbridge's institutional outreach program, which she accepted after considering it for approximately 48 hours. He continued working occasional shifts at the hotel, not because he needed the income, and not to prove any point that anyone could name. He worked them because the physical discipline of that work had been part of what kept him functional through the worst years, and because he had never quite believed that carrying a cable case through a service corridor made him a different kind of person than the one who signed acquisition agreements. Wren came to the Meridian dinner and stood near her father while he spoke briefly to the consortium directors. On the walk home afterward, she asked him whether he thought Margot Elgin understood yet why she had lost. Samuel said he didn't know. Wren said she thought Margot probably still believed she had lost because of bad timing, or incomplete information, or something external that had gone wrong at the wrong moment. Samuel said that was probably right. Wren asked whether that bothered him, that the person who had caused all of it would not change anything about herself because of it. He thought about it for a full block. He told her that the question of what Margot Elgin understood was less interesting to him than what happened to the 41 hospital networks that now had a real security system protecting their patient records, and the school districts that would stop losing weeks of data to ransomware, and the small utility operators who had been one breach away from telling their customers they could not access the water monitoring portal. That was the part that had always been the point. That was what the years at the kitchen table after midnight had actually been for. Wren said that was a very dad answer. He agreed that it was. She walked the rest of the way home with her shoulder against his arm, the way she had done since she was small enough to do it without stooping. 6 months after the Meridian agreement, a new chief executive at Elgin Technologies issued a formal public apology to Samuel, to Lena Strand, and to every partner institution whose relationship with Lockbridge had been jeopardized during the campaign against him. Margot faced civil litigation from Elgin's shareholders that would take 2 years to resolve. There was no dramatic courtroom moment, no single day of reckoning that looked the way television said reckoning looked. There was only the slow dismantling of a position that had been built on the premise that certain people existed to serve other people's tables and were not otherwise worth taking seriously. On a Thursday evening in March, Samuel was running a cable check for a conference booking at the Harrington when a new corporate client, someone he had never met, snapped his fingers twice in Samuel's direction from across the foyer. The man caught himself a half-second later. He crossed the room and apologized directly, without being prompted. Samuel told him there was no need for an apology and asked what he could help him with. It was not a lesson. It was not a moment that needed to announce itself. It was simply what happened when a person had been doing something long enough and with enough consistency that the work no longer needed to mean anything beyond itself. Later, walking home through a March evening that had just enough warmth in it to suggest the season was thinking about changing, Samuel thought about what Margaret would have made of all of it. She had always said that the most important decisions he made were the ones he made quietly, without announcing them first. He thought she would have found the whole story mildly absurd, in the way she found most things absurd, and also, underneath that, important in the way she found the right things important. A person's dignity, he had learned across these years, was not something a room could assign them or remove. Margot Elgin had believed she could redefine his with a comment and a dismissive laugh. What she had changed instead was the morning that followed, and the 41 institutions that now had a tool built for them by someone who had never stopped believing they deserved to be protected. That had always been enough. It remained enough. It was, in the end, the only part of the whole long story that had never once been in doubt.